Claire Miller used to believe that marriage was built from ordinary moments stacked carefully together. Morning coffee poured in silence, but shared. Notes left on the kitchen counter. A familiar hand reaching for hers at traffic lights. For 8 years, she and Ethan Miller had lived inside that belief, shaping their life around routines that felt unbreakable simply because they were familiar. Ethan was admired by everyone who met him. Calm, articulate, dependable. At work, he was known as a problem solver, the man who stayed late not because he had to, but because he took pride in being needed. At home, he carried that same quiet authority, though lately it came with an invisible distance. He was present in body, but his mind often drifted elsewhere, as if something beyond the walls of their house demanded more of him than Claire ever could. Claire noticed the change long before she understood it. It began with small things she dismissed as stress. Ethan stopped asking about her day in detail. His replies grew shorter, his smiles delayed. When his phone vibrated, he tilted the screen away without realizing it, his thumb moving too quickly, too carefully. None of it was enough to accuse him of anything. It was only enough to make her feel slightly alone while sitting right beside him. She told herself that marriage went through seasons. That love matured, softened, quieted. Claire had always been the kind of woman who believed patience was a form of devotion. So she waited. She filled the silence with understanding. She learned to sleep even when Ethan came home late, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne clinging to his jacket before she could convince herself it was nothing. Ethan, for his part, didn't think of himself as a man capable of betrayal. He told himself that what he felt was harmless, that admiration did not equal intention. Vanessa Brooks had entered his life through work, confident and attentive in a way that felt effortless. She laughed at his stories, remembered details, looked at him as if his words mattered deeply. After years of being seen as stable and predictable, Ethan found the reflection she offered intoxicating. Vanessa never asked him to change his life. She never criticized Claire. She simply listened, leaning slightly closer than necessary, her attention undivided. Ethan convinced himself that he deserved to feel appreciated, that it was natural to enjoy being understood. He never said the word affair to himself. He avoided it carefully, as if naming it would make it real. Claire sensed Vanessa's presence long before she knew her name. She felt it in the way Ethan's mood lifted after certain phone calls, in the distracted hum he carried into the house, in the way he spoke about work with an enthusiasm he no longer shared with her. When she finally heard Vanessa's name, it was casual, almost forgettable. A co-worker, a project lead, someone who relied on Ethan's expertise. Claire smiled and nodded. She had learned how to do that without effort. Tea night, when the house was quiet, Claire lay awake beside Ethan, listening to his breathing. She wondered when exactly she had stopped feeling like the center of his world and started feeling like a background presence. She searched her own behavior for flaws, for moments where she might have pushed him away without realizing it. The questions always circled back without answers. Ethan, meanwhile, began to live in two emotional spaces at once. With Claire, he was reliable, restrained, careful. With Vanessa, he felt lighter, sharper, more alive. The contrast unsettled him, but he avoided examining it too closely. He told himself that as long as nothing crossed an obvious line, no harm was done. He failed to understand that lines are rarely crossed in a single step. The evening that quietly shifted, everything seemed unremarkable at first. Ethan told Claire he had a late meeting. His tone was practiced, his explanation smooth. Claire watched him adjust his watch in a mirror, his reflection avoiding hers. A familiar tightness settled in her chest, heavier than suspicion, lighter than certainty. After he left, Claire sat alone at the kitchen table longer than necessary. The house felt too still. She picked up Ethan's forgotten coffee mug and held it, noticing how cold it had already become. In that moment, she realized something simple and devastating. She no longer felt secure asking where he was going or why. The thought frightened her more than any answer could have. Ethan drove through the city with a restless energy he refused to name. His phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa, brief but warm. He told himself that he would keep things controlled, that he would not allow a moment to define him. Yet even as he thought it, he felt the pull of something he had already allowed to grow beyond his grasp. Claire eventually stood, rinsed the mug, and turned off the lights. As she prepared for bed alone, she felt a quiet resolve begin to form beneath her confusion. She didn't know what the truth was yet, but she knew something essential had shifted. Trust, once effortless, now required conscious effort. An effort, she understood, was a warning sign. The night passed with both of them awake in different places, carrying the same unspoken tension. One moving closer to a choice he hadn't admitted to making. The other standing unknowingly at the edge of a reality that would soon demand more strength than she had ever needed before. Neither of them understood yet that this fragile imbalance could not last. Claire did not plan to follow Ethan that evening. The decision unfolded quietly, almost reluctantly, born not from jealousy, but from a growing need to quiet the doubt that had taken residence in her chest. She told herself she only wanted reassurance, a glimpse of normalcy she could cling to. When she stepped in her car, she still believed that whatever she found would make sense. Ethan's message about a late meeting lingered in her mind as she drove through familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. She recognized the turn he made without thinking, the one that did not lead toward his office. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her pulse quickening, not with panic, but with an odd calm that often comes before truth reveals itself. He stopped outside a building Claire had passed countless times without noticing. Modest, discreet, unremarkable. She parked a short distance away, her heart pounding as she watched Ethan step out of his car. He didn't look hurried or burdened. He looked certain. That certainty unsettled her more than any secretive glance ever had. Claire followed at a distance, each step measured, each breath controlled. She reminded herself that nothing had been proven yet, that this was still a marriage, still her husband. But the moment she reached the doorway and saw Vanessa Brooks standing inside, something inside Claire went unmistakably still. Vanessa's presence was unmistakable, not because of anything dramatic, but because of how naturally she occupied Ethan's space. The way she smiled when she saw him, the familiarity in her posture, the ease of a person who felt entitled to closeness. Claire stood frozen, invisible, as if the air itself had chosen to exclude her. She did not witness details she would later wish she could forget. What she saw was far simpler and far more devastating. Ethan leaned in, his voice low, his expression softened in a way Claire had not seen directed at her in months. Vanessa reached for him without hesitation, her hand resting where it did not belong. The intimacy was undeniable, not because of what they did, but because of how little they seemed to notice the world beyond each other. Claire felt the impact not as sharp pain, but as a hollowing force. It stripped the room of sound, reduced everything to a single, irreversible understanding. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an innocent moment. This was a choice, repeated enough times to feel effortless. Ethan turned then, as if sensing something shift in the atmosphere. Their eyes met. The color drained from his face with startling speed, the confidence she had watched earlier collapsing into something small and frightened. His mouth opened, but no words emerged. Claire realized with a strange detachment that she had imagined this moment many times, yet none of those imaginings had prepared her for how quiet it would feel. Vanessa noticed Claire seconds later. Her smile faltered only briefly before she straightened, a subtle calculation passing through her eyes. She did not apologize. She did not step away. The message was clear without being spoken, and Claire understood then that Vanessa was not confused about her role in this story. She was fully aware of it. Claire waited for anger to rise, for grief to overwhelm her, for something dramatic to demand expression. Instead, she felt clarity. Pain existed, deep and unmistakable, but did not control her. She realized, in that suspended moment, that whatever she said would not undo what had already been done. Ethan took a step toward her, his voice finally finding its way back. He said her name, Once, then again, as if repetition might pull her closer. Claire watched him with an almost clinical calm, seeing him not as the man she loved, but as someone exposed by his own decisions. She wondered how long he had believed he could manage this double life without consequence. Without raising her voice, without tears, Claire turned away. Her footsteps echoed louder than she expected, each one carrying her further from the version of herself who had trusted without question. She did not look back, though she felt Ethan's gaze follow her, heavy with shock and fear. The drive home passed in fragments. Streetlights blurred into indistinct streaks, time stretching and compressing without warning. Claire's thoughts moved deliberately, cataloging what she now knew, what she could no longer ignore. She understood that this moment would divide her life into before and after, and that nothing Ethan said next would change that fact. Ethan stood where she left him long after she was gone. Vanessa spoke, her tone uncertain, but he barely heard her. His attention remained fixed on the space Claire had occupied, on the silence she had carried with her. For the first time, the weight of his choices pressed in fully, unfiltered by excuses or justification. When Claire arrived home, the house greeted her with familiar stillness. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching objects as if to confirm their reality. The photos on the walls, the life they had built, all of it suddenly felt fragile, as though meaning itself had shifted. She did not cry that night. She did not call anyone. Instead, she sat in the dark and allowed the truth to settle, heavy but undeniable. She knew instinctively that what came next would require more than confrontation. It would require restraint, resolve, and a strength she had not yet fully discovered. As Ethan's unanswered calls began to light up her phone, Claire turned it face down and closed her eyes. Silence, she sensed, was about to become her loudest response. Ethan woke to silence that felt wrong. The house was empty in a way it had never been before, not merely quiet but stripped of presence. Claire's side of the bed was untouched, the sheets smooth, as if she had never slept there at all. For a brief, disoriented moment, he convinced himself that she had left early for an errand. The lie dissolved the instant he noticed her phone charger missing from the outlet. He called her once, then again, pacing the length of the bedroom as the line rang unanswered. Each attempt tightened the knot in his chest. Claire had always replied, even when she was upset, even when words were few. Her silence was unfamiliar territory, and it unsettled him more than any argument ever had. At work, Ethan sat through meetings without absorbing a word. His phone lay face up on the table, his attention fixed on screen. Vanessa noticed his distraction immediately. She leaned close, her voice low, asking if everything was all right. He nodded automatically, offering a thin smile that convinced neither of them. By midday, his messages to Claire had shifted from cautious apologies to raw pleas. He typed and erased repeatedly, unable to find language that felt sufficient. He avoided calling his mother, Margaret, knowing she would ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. For the first time in years, he felt profoundly alone inside a world he had carefully constructed. Claire, meanwhile, sat in a quiet cafe across town, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea. She had chosen the place deliberately, somewhere unfamiliar, neutral. She needed distance from the life she had been living, space to hear her own thoughts without interruption. The absence of Ethan's voice was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of preservation. She replayed the moment of discovery with unsettling clarity, not searching for pain, but for understanding. Each time, the same realization surfaced. Ethan had not hesitated. The intimacy she witnessed had been practiced, comfortable. That knowledge hardened something within her, transforming shock into resolve. Daniel Reed arrived without fanfare, as he always did. He had been Claire's friend long before her marriage, a constant presence who never demanded explanations. When he saw her expression, he asked only one question, and when she shook her head, he accepted the silence that followed. Support, she realized, did not always require words. Ethan left work early, his unease growing with each unanswered attempt to reach Claire. He drove past familiar places, half expecting to see her car parked where it shouldn't be. Each empty street deepened his fear. He stopped outside their house, then drove on, unable to face the possibility that she might not be there. Vanessa called him that evening, her tone edged with insecurity. She asked what they were going to do now, as if the events of the previous night had transformed their connection into something solid. Ethan ended the call abruptly, the sound of her voice stirring frustration rather than comfort. For the first time, he saw their involvement not as escape, but as complication. Claire returned home late, long enough to know Ethan would be gone. She moved quietly, packing only what she needed. Each item she chose felt deliberate, an acknowledgement of what mattered and what no longer did. She left behind objects tied to shared memories, not out of bitterness, but because they belonged to a chapter she was no longer willing to live inside. Ethan arrived shortly after she left. He noticed the absence immediately, the open closet space, the missing suitcase. Panic surged through him, sharp and consuming. He called her again, his voice cracking as he left a message he knew she might never hear. The realization that he could lose her completely settled over him with suffocating weight. That night, Ethan sat alone in the dark, replaying every moment he had dismissed as insignificant. He thought of Claire's patience, her quiet loyalty, the way she had made space for him without ever asking for credit. The magnitude of what he stood to lose finally came into focus, stripped of excuses and justification. Claire stayed with Daniel, sleeping in a room that felt temporary but safe. Lying awake, she acknowledged the ache that still lived in her chest, but she did not allow it to define her choices. She understood that silence was not avoidance. It was clarity. It gave her control over a narrative that had been written without her consent. WY morning, Ethan's desperation had transformed into fear. Not fear of exposure or judgment, but fear of absence. Claire's silence forced him to confront a truth he had avoided for months. He had underestimated her strength. He had mistaken her patience for permanence. As the day stretched on, Claire made a decision she had been circling since the night before. She would speak when she was ready, not when Ethan demanded it. The power shift was subtle but irreversible. Ethan stared at his phone, willing it to light up, unaware that the silence he feared was shaping the moment when he would finally have to listen. Claire agreed to meet Ethan on a morning chosen deliberately for its ordinariness. No anniversaries, no emotionally charged dates, nothing that could lend false symbolism to the conversation. She arrived early, selecting a seat near the window where the light softened sharp edges without hiding them. Calm was not something she felt naturally that day. It was something she practiced with intention. Ethan arrived 10 minutes late, breathless, his composure fragile. When he saw Claire, relief crossed his face too quickly, as though her presence alone promised forgiveness. The assumption unsettled her, but she said nothing. She waited, letting the silence establish its terms that he spoke first, his words tumbling over one another in hurried apology. He took responsibility in fragments, admitting mistakes without yet naming their depth. Claire listened without interruption, noting how often his explanations centered on his fear of losing her rather than on the pain he had caused. The distinction mattered more than he realized. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. She described what she had seen, not accusing, not dramatic, but precise. Each detail was delivered calmly, stripping away any remaining space for denial. Ethan flinched, his gaze dropping to the table as the reality of his actions settled fully into the room. He reached for her hand and stopped himself halfway, as if suddenly aware that permission could no longer be assumed. The restraint surprised him. Claire noticed, and in that pause, she understood that boundaries, once crossed, must be rebuilt deliberately, if at all. Ethan confessed that he had believed control would protect him, that as long as he managed the situation, no one would be truly hurt. Saying it aloud made the flaw in his reasoning undeniable. Claire did not argue. She did not need to. The consequences had already proven the point. She told him she was leaving, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Trust, she explained, could not survive where safety had been compromised. Ethan asked if there was still hope, his voice quieter now, stripped of urgency. Claire considered the question carefully, honoring it with honesty rather than comfort. She said she did not know, not because she wanted to punish him, but because she refused to promise something she could not guarantee. Healing, she understood, required space, and space was something she had been denied for too long. Vanessa attempted to contact Ethan later that day. He did not answer. The silence he once feared now felt appropriate, a reflection of consequences rather than avoidance. He began to understand that validation taken without integrity was never free. It carried a cost that arrived eventually, whether invited or not. Claire returned to her own routine slowly. She found comfort in structure, in the predictability of mornings and the quiet satisfaction of evenings spent without pretense. Daniel remained present but unobtrusive, offering support without expectation. Through him, Claire relearned the value of being seen without being consumed. Ethan moved through his days with a new awareness, one that left little room for self-deception. He spoke with his mother, Margaret, who listened without softening the truth. Her disappointment was measured, but it was unmistakable. Accountability, she reminded him, was not performative. It was lived. Weeks passed. The urgency faded, replaced by reflection. Ethan wrote letters he did not send, learning through the act of writing what he had failed to articulate before. Claire read none of them, choosing instead to listen to her own instincts, which had proven trustworthy at last. When they met again, it was brief and respectful. Practical matters were handled without hostility. Claire noticed that Ethan no longer tried to control the narrative. He accepted her terms, whatever they might become. That acceptance, though late, was real as they parted. Claire felt a quiet certainty settle within her. She did not know what the future held, whether it included reconciliation or permanent separation. What she knew was this: she would no longer shrink to preserve someone else's comfort. Ethan watched her leave, understanding at last that love without honesty was not love at all, but avoidance dressed as devotion. The lesson arrived too late to undo the damage, but not too late to change him. Claire stepped into the daylight, carrying not bitterness, but clarity. The story did not end with resolution or reunion, but with choice. And for the first time in a long while, the choice belonged entirely to her.